What's up YouTube community, Bernd here, welcome back to the channel. This time we focus on the really exciting and very important topic of the modes once again, since you guys and girls voted for that on the lesson wishlist on Patreon for this month. I know that the modes can seem very confusing in the beginning, especially if you didn't work on a lot of music theory yet, but I promise after watching this video they will make a lot more sense, especially in a rock and metal context. So let's not waste any more time and get started right away. My biggest goal with this video is breaking down the concept and system of the modes to the smallest possible level. So instead of focusing on all 7 modes right away, we will only work on 2 of them today. I would dare to say that those are also the 2 most common scales you will come across if you're into rock, metal and shred guitar playing. So instead of overwhelming you with a lot of complex information today, I really just want you to understand the connection between those 2 scales we're looking at today. And once you completely get that connection and understand it in a musical way, the rest of the modes will open up for you easily. So let's begin right away. First of all, we can divide the modes into 2 different groups, the modes in major and the modes in minor. And here's what's really exciting and helpful, we can also go one step further and define one fundamental scale for major and minor. What I mean by that is actually already the most important piece of information I want you to remember today. You mostly only have to change one note in those fundamental major and minor modes to get all the other modes, with the exception of the least popular mode that's called Locrian. I know that almost sounds too good to be true, and when I discovered this connection between all the most popular modes, they finally made sense to me. But let's make this concept even smaller and easier for today and only focus on 2 minor modes. We will focus on a direct comparison of Aeolian, the fundamental minor mode, and Phrygian, a small variation of that sound. The great news is that you might already be able to play the Aeolian scale all across the neck, because it's just another name for the natural minor scale. So those 2 fundamental modes I just talked about in major and minor, Ionian and Aeolian, are actually just the natural major and the natural minor scale. And the way that I mostly remember learning the modes when I was studying guitar at the conservatory was essentially just learning one mode all across the neck every single week. And it's quite easy for a teacher to give you a good or a bad grade for that, since it's quite easy to measure in terms of did you put your fingers on the wrong or on the right frets. But by just learning them mechanically like that, almost like an exercise, I basically got a good grade without actually knowing what I'm doing and what kind of notes I'm playing and how to use all that in a practical context. So I can really recommend not starting to think in those scale boxes right away. First I would visualize the scale in just 1 octave and really think about the notes and the intervals that I'm playing. Let's work in the key of E minor today. So 1 E you might be able to locate easily already, aside from the lower open E string of course, is the E we have right here on the 7th fret on the A string. So let's make that one our root note, the lowest note for our scale. When I'm playing all notes of the E minor scale in this location with E on the 7th fret on the A string as my lowest note, I get the following result: E, F sharp, G, A, B, C, D, and up to E once again, to the octave. So instead of immediately turning the full scale box into a technique exercise or studying the scale all across the fretboard without knowing the notes that you're playing, I really recommend just playing this fragment of the scale, all the notes up until the octave, and to really remember the notes that you're playing, the whole steps and the half steps in the scale, and the intervals. Because once you really remember and understand this small scale phrase, you can move it with the octave trick we discussed on the channel. Because I have E right here, I can easily visualize the scale in this position, but I also have E right here, so I can play the exact same notes in a different octave. I have E right here, but I'm missing the next string, so I can only play it up until here with the same pattern. Then of course I have E right here on the 12th fret on the low E string, so the same scale phrase right here on the 14th fret of the D string, then up here on the 17th fret on the B string, and so on. So by memorizing this small fragment and thinking in octaves, I can basically play the entire scale across the neck already. But the real and exciting benefit from thinking like that becomes very clear as soon as you start working with the modes. So let's check out the notes of the E Phrygian mode right now. So let's start again with E right here on the 7th fret on the A string, and the notes of the E Phrygian scale are E, F, G, A, B, C, D, and then here we are at E once again. Now if you paid close attention right here, you notice that there's just one note that is different from the natural minor scale. Instead of playing F sharp on the 9th fret on the A string, that would be the major second in the natural minor scale, we are playing F on the 8th fret on the A string, and that's the characteristic minor second interval of the Phrygian scale. So this is what really defines that Phrygian sound. So we get that really cool, dark and kind of mysterious sound that you can hear in tons of metal riffs. Especially in comparison to the more tame sound of the major second in the natural minor scale. That doesn't really have that classic metal riff sound. So that brings us to the next very important point, when to actually use the natural minor scale and when to use the Phrygian scale. I prepared a couple of practical examples today that make this much easier to understand. That way you can start improvising, learning these scales and getting a feeling for the sound right after watching this lesson until the end. So the very easy and musical way of understanding which scale to use in a practical context is actually very similar to the system we looked at when we were studying the scale for the first time. So both riffs I prepared for the jam tracks are heavily focused on the low open E string, since that's a very common cliché for metal riffs. But the first riff has the E, F sharp and G power chords in it. So that would be an immediate indicator to use the natural minor scale because of the note F sharp, the major second above the root. So those are the notes E, F sharp and G. Actually the first three notes of the natural minor scale, of the E natural minor scale. But the second riff has a big focus on F, on that half step above the root. So that of course would be an immediate indicator to use the E Phrygian scale, since E, F and G are basically just the first three notes in the Phrygian scale. And when I play F sharp over that F power chord, it will sound really, really terrible. So I'm playing the F power chord and F sharp of the E natural minor scale over that. And that sounds pretty terrible. And in the beginning I just assumed that I can play the E minor scale over that, and that mostly worked until that F sharp was clashing with F in the riff. So for the first example, and I really hope that won't hurt your ears too much, I'm playing the E Phrygian scale over the riff in E natural minor. So as you can hear, that doesn't really work out too well whenever I'm playing F, the characteristic note of the E Phrygian scale that really clashes with F sharp in the riff. And with that I want to show you of course that the riff and the chords in the background are mostly responsible for your scale choices, and you can't just pick Phrygian because you really like the sound. You also have to pay attention to the musical environment and the composition you're playing over. Let's do the opposite now and play the natural minor scale over the Phrygian riff. As you can hear, that unsurprisingly sounds equally painful, so it also doesn't work the other way around, and the natural minor scale isn't some kind of safe zone that you can apply to all kinds of riffs. I really want you to pay attention to the notes in the riffs from now on to make the best melodic choices. And for the last and very surprising example, I will play the correct scale, the Phrygian scale, over the Phrygian riff, but I will constantly accent that characteristic note F in my improvised take. So from a music theory standpoint, I'm doing nothing wrong. Let's see if it also sounds like that. So that also sounds pretty weird because F, that minor second in the scale, is a really dissonant note. So this is a note in the scale similar to the minor sixth that you can use to add a lot of tension to your licks and that kind of dark color. It would be the minor second right here, F, and the minor sixth, C. So not really the most melodic notes in the world. So although those are the right notes, from a music theory standpoint, you have to be very careful with using them, and you will never be able to do that and actually sound good with the scales that you're using when you just learn where to put your fingers on the fretboard. So I know that this was quite a lot to take in from a music theory perspective today. To quickly summarize today's video, I would personally start out by learning either the natural minor or natural major scale, both in the best case, just in one octave on the fretboard, really memorizing the notes that you are playing, the whole tone, half tone structure and the intervals. And then you know all 7 notes of either the fundamental major or minor mode that you need to build all those other modes. And as we discussed, you mostly just have to change one note to get all those other interesting modes, with the exception of Locrian, which is also the least popular mode. For today's lesson, we chose to work with Phrygian, since it's a very common metal and rock scale. And for that one, we just had to change the major second of natural minor or Aeolian to a minor second to get Phrygian. Instead of just moving boxes around the fretboard and really not thinking about the notes that you are playing, you will be able to improvise, compose, play and understand much more interesting material that way. You will get a much better understanding of which scale you should use in which practical context. And of course, maybe that's the most important aspect, you will learn a lot of scales really fast, because you just have to change minor details in them. So you don't have to be intimidated with the modes anymore and think, okay, this month I'm learning Aeolian, next month I'm trying to understand Phrygian, and then I'm switching to the major modes, and next month I'm learning Lydian, and so on. These scales are all very connected, and as soon as you're able to visualize the natural major and minor scale, or the Ionian and Aeolian mode all across the neck, you can just make those small changes, just change one note in each position to get the Dorian mode, the Phrygian mode, the Lydian mode, the Mixolydian mode, and if you're really motivated, you can also study the Locrian mode after that. And whenever you discover a riff or a chord that has one of those characteristic notes in it, for example a major chord with the sharp 4 Lydian interval in it, you immediately have a great understanding of which scale you can use to play over that. In the end, don't forget to download your backing tracks for this lesson on patreon.com/Bernd. Over there you can also download the tabs, guitar profiles, practice backing tracks, video play-alongs, PDF files and much more for every single YouTube lesson that I ever uploaded so far. So make sure to check that out today. I will see you again in the next video lesson. All the best and have a lot of fun working on the modes until then.